Introducing 100 Days of Code with Treehouse. What is 100 Days of Code? It's a long-standing coding challenge created by Alex Callaway, and it's simple. Commit to learning every day for 100 days. The amount that you learn in that short time frame will change your life. Whether you want to level up your skills or jumpstart a new career, commit to the challenge. You'll be shocked by how much you learn and accomplish. You'll have the full support of the Treehouse community of students working with you. We'll be sending you motivational emails, clips from our 100 Days of Code podcast, featuring advice, tips and tricks from developers, and so much more. There's never been a better time to commit to your learning. Join us. Hello, welcome to another edition of Design Q&A. So this is the second of the series. So if you're curious about seeing the first one, you can check out the recording later. All right, looks like all systems are a go. And so I'm gonna get started. If I can click the right screen. Okay, cool. So I'm Hope Armstrong. I'm a senior product designer and UX design teacher here at Treehouse. Treehouse is the place to go for learning how to design and develop websites and mobile apps. So if you're curious to learn more, you can go to teamtreehouse.com. And if you sign up for a free 7-day trial, you'll be able to see our entire catalog. And you can see all the courses and workshops and practice sessions that we put together for you. So without further ado, let's go into the questions. So if you have any questions, we do have Treehouse staff moderating the chat. So feel free to pop them in there, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. And whichever ones I don't get to today, I'll try to address them in my next live stream. So just to get the conversation flowing, I'm going to answer some questions from our previous live stream. Some ones that were great questions, I just didn't have time to answer live. So this first one is about color, which I love to talk about. I love the energy of this question too. How do you go about selecting colors for your projects? I spend a lot of my time doing this, LOL. Yeah, color is something that everyone struggles with, especially starting out. And even just as you go in your career and you get more experience, there's some days where I really struggle with color, and other days it just kind of hits me like bing, bang, boom. Like I just know what I'm doing. I can imagine it and I can create the perfect palette. But, it's not always that simple. Let's see. All right. So one of my tricks that I do is I look for inspiration, and inspiration for color can really be anywhere. You can go for a walk and see someone's shoe that you like and pull colors from a random Adidas shoe, or you can look online. I like to look at dribble.com. So Dribble, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's a site where creatives go to post their work. So there's really a range of things on there. So there's illustrations, there's UI design, there's all kinds of things. So you can get inspiration from an illustration. So here is an illustration from one of my favorite illustrators, Anna Hurley. And something cool about Dribble is it pulls a color palette for everything that's submitted. So you can see all the key colors from the illustration. Whoops. And so you end up with, you can end up with something that kind of looks like this. And if you go to any kind of color inspiration site, you'll end up with maybe, 5 colors of really, that are really bright and vibrant and look really fun. And when you add that to your UI, it might end up looking something like this, which is probably not what you wanted. So this is an example from refactoringui.com, which is a great site that Steve Stroger put together, and he goes through really good explanations of design fundamentals like color and how to apply that in UI. So color here is really not very successful because you can see all these bright primary colors that are competing with one another. So really you want to be intentional about your use of color and really help it create hierarchy in your designs. So here we have a really bold yellow and red and blue, and it's kind of hard to know where to look. I mean, the alert where the oops text is really stands out to me. So I definitely want to look there, but then there's the yellow is so bright and the blue is so bold. So really, this is a more successful take on color in this UI. And you can see that the palette has really grown a lot. So there's more neutrals, and color is used more sparingly. It's kind of like, the less is more. So if you just use a little bit of the teal, then it really makes the notification ticker stand out. And if you just use a little bit of the yellow, it really helps this alert banner stand out. And they're using the tints and shades of that yellow to create some dimensionality. So my tips for building a color palette is to choose a primary color and then choosing some accent colors. So accent colors usually include things like success, warning, and error indications, and whatever other colors that you want to use to draw the eye in certain parts of the UI. And then there's also plenty of neutrals because, as you can see, not every color can be screaming and vibrant. You really need some neutrals to balance everything out. So let's go back to that example I showed of Anna Hurley's illustration. This is the color palette pulled from that. And I just decided to choose the hot pink as a primary. Why not? It's fun. And for the accents, this orange, this yellow, and the green. And then for the neutrals, I chose this kind of brownish gray. I liked how it had a little bit of warmth to it. With grays, you can have a little fun with them because you can have bluer grays that are more on the cooler temperature of side of things. And then you can have grays that are warmer that have more of like a yellow or an orange undertone. And so from there, I would just pull in tints by adding white, or in other words, just lowering the opacity with this white background, and adding black to create shades. And so from that, you have a much more sophisticated color palette that you can play around with. And, something that I kind of lost with tinting the neutrals here is it didn't really stay as warm as I wanted it to be. So I kind of wanted more of like a beigey color to end off here as a highlight. And so that's just to say that color's not super scientific. So you can't just like put it in an algorithm or like put it in a tool and like expect consistent results. Because there's different ways that we perceive color and like how the colors interact with whites and black. I mean, there's all this color science to it that I'm not educated enough to talk about, but I certainly have played around with color enough to know that you can like fudge it to really get the effect that you want. So for instance, I wasn't super interested in how cool or neutral these grays were getting. So I added some warmer tones to make it more of like a beige. And so by the way, I just played around in the color wheel by adding, sliding it over to be more of on the a lighter yellow to orange side of things. So if you do want help creating a monochromatic palette, there are tools out there. I linked to one in the Figma presentation that I have here. which we can share a link in the chat if that hasn't happened yet, because I know I have a lot of links in here. And so I try to make it easy on y'all to just click it from the Figma presentation. So another thing to consider when you're building your color palette is making sure that you have accessible color combinations. So here's a tool that I found in GitHub, and it actually takes a color palette and combines the colors together in this matrix. So this is pretty interesting. You can see that beige text on a neutral background is accessible in terms of the color contrast score. But if you wanted to put that pink text on a neutral background, that would not have enough color contrast to be visible. So you can play around with this as you build your color palette to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success. And, of course, I just pulled in the key colors that I started out with. I did have some more tints and shades to work with. So in reality, I have a lot more range. All right. And as you keep going, just make sure that you drop in the colors into your UI. When you see it as a palette, it's so abstract and you don't really know how it's going to look together. So the only way you can really know is if you start dropping it into your UI. As you can see here, I did end up using that hot pink as a headline. I just wanted to make a little note that this tool just does accessible color combinations for body text, which is stricter in terms of its color contrast scores. So with headlines, you do have some more leeway, and headlines specifically above 18 points, they don't have to be quite as contrasty. So this hot pink on the white or the beige, I can't remember which one I used, it actually does meet the contrast scores. But if you wanted to be even more stringent with your accessibility standards, then you could make this a shade of that hot pink instead. All right, so I'm just going to pause here for a second and see if we have any questions in the chat. All right, so someone asked Sketch versus Adobe, which one is used to design Team Treehouse? So I actually use Sketch to do all my design at Treehouse, and I'm actually going to get into that in a bit. But, there are certain things that I love to use Adobe Illustrator for. And in the case of a lot of my course content, I actually demo Adobe XD because they do have a free version, and it's also available on a wider range of platforms. Sketch is actually just available for Mac users, and not all of our students are Mac users. And it also has a paid license. It doesn't have a free option, so it's not accessible for our audience. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. You might, I don't know if you were asking specifically about Adobe XD, but I do use Photoshop if I want to use, if I want to edit any images. Adobe Photoshop really is my favorite for editing photos or anything raster. Adobe Illustrator I use for more complex pen work. Or, really getting into some illustration that's not super like geometric, because I do use Sketch for illustrations, but not when I want to use more complex curves or any more like effects or of that kind. All right, I think that's it for the questions. I do have a practice session exploring color, and it's basically something I take a design for a chat app. It actually kind of is similar to Slack, if you're familiar with that. And I really poorly apply color to it. And then I give that to the students, and everyone tries to apply color and improve color in the UI. And then I also share what I ended up doing with the color in the UI. And of course, there's all different kinds of results. There's no right answer. I just show it as an example, but it's a good way to practice color. All right, so next question. What tool do you prefer to do the prototyping? So this is a great question. There's a lot of design tools out there. And there's really some more advanced prototyping tools that I don't use, but I just in terms of like more complex animations that you can do. I mean, some people use Adobe After Effects to really do full-on prototypes, but for my purposes, a lot of the things are pretty straightforward. Linking different screens and so on. So I love to use Sketch, which is still like one of the most popular design tools out there. A lot of teams use Sketch. And one of the reasons why we chose Sketch at Treehouse is because it integrates well with Abstract. So Abstract is a tool that makes it easy to store your files, especially if you're working with a team of people. And so like multiple people can work on the same file, and there's version control, and you basically can create branches and you can merge those branches. For anyone watching who's familiar with GitHub, it's just like that, but for designers. So for anyone who's not familiar with GitHub, you basically can work on the same file, but create different versions of the file, and then it can compare and contrast visually what each person added, and then you can decide like this is the final design, and then it's easy to have this like history of the design file. So yeah, specifically for prototyping, back on track. I love using the Envision Craft plugin for Sketch, and then it's just integrated within Sketch, so I can set up all of the interaction points in my Sketch app, and then I just say, okay, sync to envision.com. And then in Envision, I can share the prototype with the product, a product manager or another designer or developer, and then they can leave comments. And so, like, as I mentioned before, a drawback to Sketch is that it does require a license. So there's a cost there, and it's only for Mac users. So it's limited to based on your platform. But I also really enjoy using Figma. Actually, this presentation is made in Figma. And I do enjoy it for some things, specifically like if I'm sharing something that I want to collaborate live with someone, or they need to add text to it, but they don't have like a Sketch license or something. And also Adobe XD, I love creating content for Treehouse, teaching Adobe XD. I find it's really easy to learn how to use, and it's not intimidating like some other design tools can be. They've really streamlined the UI, so there aren't like too many options available all at once. So both of these are available for Mac and Windows, and they both also have a free plan. And they also have prototyping built in. So instead of doing that integration with Envision, you can just prototype within. Sketch also does have prototyping built in. I just haven't really used that workflow because the commenting and Envision is just something that our team prefers. All right, so let's see, another question. What is the best mockup application for someone using Windows 8? It seems to be hard to find anything that works with Windows 8. That's a good question, and I don't have the answer because I don't use Windows 8. So that is something I just don't know. I'd have to research that. I would just start Googling, like you've probably done already. So I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that one. Can you list some useful resources for color theory and UI? Color theory and UI. I mean, I would look at refactoring UI and specifically check out Steve Stroger on Twitter. How do you spell his name? That's a good question. Schroger, possibly. But if you look at refactoring UI, you can find him. And he has a lot of tweets about things like this, color in the UI. Another person that comes to mind is Diana Mounter, who leads the design systems team at GitHub. I saw her do a talk on color, which I think is on YouTube. If you Google her name, Diana Mounter, I think it's Mounter. This feels like a spelling bee. So she talks. There's a talk where she talks about color, and she talks about the primary color on GitHub, which is called blue jeans, which is adorable because it's this blue that kind of does look like the blue jeans in your closet. But she kind of goes into her process of how they went through hundreds of different colors of blue, and like she really gets into color theory and how she thinks about building their color palette. And I don't know, she's a really interesting person. The talk was very interesting about how she approached color and, building that into the GitHub design system. Okay, so I think that's it for now in terms of spontaneous questions. Feel free to keep them coming. That does it does help for me to understand like what's on your mind, and it kind of makes this more of a conversation instead of me just talking at you. I do have a course where I go through how to create interactive prototypes in Adobe XD. So if you sign up for teamtreehouse.com, you can see how I do that. And I also go into the principles of interaction design in this course if you're curious about a little bit of theory along with the practical application of things. And we also have this practice prototyping workshop for Adobe XD. And we also have Figma content too. I just didn't want to overwhelm you by showing all the things. But if you are a Figma fan, there's something for you there too. All right. So this question was asked in the last live stream, and it caught me off guard because it's such a hard question. How do you know when UI is done in a software dev sprint? Yes. This is kind of, there's two parts of answering this question. The first one is it's really never done. It's kind of endless, right? Because you're creating something that's sort of a living organism, and your target users will change over time. The product will change, maybe a piece of your UI that you're adding to the app makes sense at the time, but then over the evolution of the product, it doesn't make sense there anymore because it's evolved. So it's kind of always done or it's never done. So you're always seeking to learn more about your user base and the growing needs of the business. And I need to change slides because I realize I'm getting kind of dizzy looking at this animated GIF. So sorry about that if it's causing strain for anyone. The longer answer is, does it meet the goals? So that really starts out with the beginning of the sprint. So if anyone is unfamiliar with Agile Development or sprints in general, that was mentioned in the question, it basically starts out as planning what you're going to do. And then you implement it, and then you review and have a retrospective and everything. But so at the beginning of your project, you should be thinking about what are the goals that you're setting out to solve. So you might have a user story that's, as a website user, I need a home button so that I can return to the home page with a click or a tap. And I realize that's obviously a very simplistic story. but that's a good basic one to start with, and I just pulled it from an old blog post that we had on the Treehouse blog. And so from there, you might have acceptance criteria such as the home button is visible on all pages. Clicking the home button returns the user to the home page, and the home button is recognizable. And so that's all specific to the exact story in mind, but there's also overall criteria. Maybe it needs to fit in with the design system, the branding, needs to be accessible, needs to be cross-browser compatible, it needs to pass design and code review, and so on. So if it passes all those things, great. But it's not always that simple. Often as UX designers, we're dealing with really complex problems, and it's not as simple enough to look at a list and decide for yourself if it is successful. You really just need to do some user testing. You can do usability testing with just 5 users and already see all the trends that you need to see, as long as they, were recruited properly and are in your target audience. And then you can take notes on those user interviews, and you can identify any trends using an affinity diagram. So in reality, the design process looks something like this. It's not super linear. You don't just map, sketch, decide, prototype, test, and then pass with flying colors, and then never look back. You actually you'll test, you'll realize, sorry, I feel like tiny burp. You'll test it, you'll realize some things aren't quite working, and then you'll have to go back to earlier parts in your design process and start all over with a new hypothesis. So you'll mostly end up in one of these 3 buckets, and I did get this from Google Ventures library. So it's part of their design sprint information that they have, and they have a lot of it. So basically, you might be in the camp of most of the stuff worked, and you can just tweak it and keep going. Or you might have some really big questions. So maybe you can tweak a few things, but the overarching big idea that you're solving, you have some concerns about, and maybe you didn't quite solve it like you thought you would. So you'll need to go back to the sketching phase. And then maybe everything exploded and nothing worked, and you just have to completely go back to square one at better understanding the problem. Perhaps you made some assumptions that were incorrect, and you just need to start all over. So that was all stuff that helps inform you of the user and how it's working for the user. So at the end of your sprint, you might say, well, I guess I need to start the next sprint by readdressing these concerns instead of moving on to the next problem to solve. And then this next part is about the retrospective. So as part of any as part of any sprint in the Agile development process, you have a retrospective with your team. And you can do a couple different activities, or you can do any number of activities, but I'll just talk about a couple. So one is called the good, the bad, and the ugly. So you can ask what went well, what didn't go well, and what are the brutal facts, like anything that you're a little too shy to say, but really would help the team at addressing something that needs to be fixed. And then you can also do a timeline, so everyone can have a column in a spreadsheet, and then you can write something down that, or you can write down your process as you remember it from the sprint, and just try to do it in chronological order. So you can basically see here's the chart. So if I'm Eliza, I would go through step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Maybe I was waiting on copy for the website for a long time, and that really blocked my process, and I couldn't create a prototype that had enough meaningful information for me to glean insights from. So in the next retrospective, I could maybe the team could prioritize getting that copy or that text sooner. And, by the way, this team would be maybe a product owner, a developer, some designers, and so on. So it's really a cross-functional team. And what you'll see is, from everyone's perspective, how it went. And you'll see certain themes, like maybe 3 people said the same thing, and that creates some more weight into what they said, and kind of highlights it as something that can be addressed in the next sprint. All right, so any questions on that section before I move on to the next one? Let's see, I'll check over here in the chat. All right, looks like no big questions here so far. Next one is, do you have any recommendations on UX tools that have helped you? Yes, for sure. So, every UX designer's tool set looks different. I just wanted to preface it by saying that, but I will share what I have and what works for me. And it really will be dependent on your team and what you've aligned around. Design teams often decide on, hey, everyone's going to use Figma, or hey, everyone's going to use Adobe XD, right? So you do you. There's a lot of tools to accomplish the same things. But hopefully by showing what tools I use, it'll inspire you to maybe work them into your workflow, or just help you understand maybe some tools that are out there that you didn't know about. So my first big tool is Google search. I mean, just even building this talk, I Googled all the things, and I always want to make sure that I'm up to snuff and I have the best advice to provide. So and whenever I get stuck, I just go to Google search too. But in general, when I'm in the research phase, I do all my user interviews in Zoom, and I take notes in Google Docs. And whenever I want to find users to recruit, I'll actually either just reach out to them through the app, or I'll, in the past, I've actually used Intercom. They have that little chat window that comes up in the bottom right corner of your screen. And so we can actually segment our audience. For instance, if I'm working on a tech degree part of the app, then I can specifically show that message for tech degree students only. And I can say, hey, are you interested in doing a user interview? If I'm not interested in recruiting myself, I've used usertesting.com, which does all the work for you. They find they recruit the participants for you, and you just send them the prototype, and they send you a recording of the person interacting with the prototype and answering any questions that you might have for them. I've also used Hotjar for creating heat maps of a website. So that basically tells you, hey, on this given page, a lot of people click here. Maybe that area is not even clickable. It just looks clickable when it's not. So that's a good insight to have. Maybe people don't scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page. Maybe most people drop off at the halfway point. So that's really good to know if you have something important that's lower down on the screen. A lot of people aren't seeing it. And there's also Google Analytics. This was helpful whenever I was trying to understand what browsers most of our users use at Treehouse, and it can help you create basically a sense for what browsers you really need to check for to make sure that your UI is cross-browser compatible. And then Ask Nicely is great for gathering NPS scores. And so it's basically, you've probably seen it on a website at some point. You probably just didn't know it was called NPS. But it's basically, it asks you, how likely are you to recommend this product to someone else or to a friend? And it'll be a score of 1, or a scale of 1 through 10. And, 1 being poor, or 1, I wouldn't recommend it to my enemy, and 10, I love it. I recommend it to everyone I know, everyone I see in the elevator. I don't know. Let's see, I have a question. I'm a graphic designer looking to make the switch to UX design. I have been taking coding courses through Treehouse, wondering how far in depth I would need to learn code to be successful in UX. Oh, okay. Yeah, this is a highly debated question in the design community, which is basically, should designers code in a sense? I think it is really helpful if you do want to learn how to code. I personally love coding, and I have used it a lot in my design career, and it has really helped me a lot because I have worked for smaller teams who really benefit from having someone who is skilled in different areas. But at the same time, there's plenty of UX designers that don't code at all, and they do amazing stuff. They might focus more on research than I do, or they might go deeper in some area that I don't go as deep in. And so I think that's fine to just follow your interest. But in terms of how deep you need to go in terms of code to be successful in UX, I would say definitely learn HTML and CSS. I mean, that's really the predominant things that you need to know. CSS is all about styling elements in HTML. So if you can get those 2 things down, then I think you're 90% of the way there. A nice to have is JavaScript. So much of the web is JavaScript based now. And so if you know any JavaScript frameworks, React, other ones, I don't know. React is so popular now. And that will really help you create more interactions in your code. So HTML and CSS are quite static, but JavaScript is more about like getting into the dynamic nature of the web, which is very exciting. But there's a learning curve with learning JavaScript, of course. Because it's more of like a pure programming language, whereas HTML and CSS are more like Markdown. If you do want to get more advanced into CSS, you can learn Sass, which is basically a preprocessor for CSS, which you can do some more advanced dynamic stuff in there, which is really fun with variables and so on. So yeah, I hope that answered your question. But yeah, if you're interested in code, learn as much as you can. But as long as you know HTML and CSS, you're really set up to go a long way. All right, so next up in my toolkit is define. So you can, so I use JIRA, which is a project management tool, to keep track of all the things that I have in progress and all the backlog of things I'd love to make happen in the product. And then I also keep notes in Google Docs. And then for iterating, I love to sketch on paper, especially if it's some idea that's like brand new and hasn't been done before. And I just want to be free enough to just draw whatever and be really experimental and brainstorm. If it's something that I've already, that's already been created, like I'm building off of an existing UI, I'll often just start iterating in Sketch. Since I already have I already have a lot of known knowns, so it's a little less experimental. And maybe I just want to jump right into the Sketch file. Because once it's in Sketch, you can really build it out from wireframe to prototype really quickly. And then, like I said before, just, abstract to back it up. And I also use Figma for anything that, as I said, I want to share with someone who might not have a Sketch license. Figma is really accessible for folks to drop in. Maybe it's someone from the marketing department who's going to add in some text to one of my designs. I want to make it really easy for them to do that. And then from Sketch, as I said, I just I sync it with the Craft plugin to InVision. And then here's the development side of things. So the person who asked about designers coding might get some benefit from this. And anyone else who's interested in coding. So I do use Chrome as my browser of choice. I've just gotten so comfortable with DevTools in there, which is basically if you right click on a web page, you'll see in the drop down it says, or on the context menu it says inspect. And that's where you can see under the hood and see how the web page is built. And so I dig around in there whenever I see any kind of bugs or I'm trying to work through some kind of problem I'm having. There's a console and everything if you want to get into like seeing all your JavaScript errors and whatnot. And then I use Sublime Text for my code editor. A lot of people use Atom, or what's that other one? Oh, well, whatever. There's a bunch of them, but yeah, Sublime Text is great. Browser Stack for anyone who's like starting to zone out because they're not interested in coding. Browser Stack is great for designers who don't code even. It's a way for you to see how a website will look across different platforms. So you can see how your website looks on Windows 8, for instance, and older versions of IE, if you're brave. You can see it in Chrome and Firefox and Safari and so on, and also different operating systems. So between all those things, if you rearrange them in all the different configurations, there's quite a few different ways that websites can render, and you'll find these really weird bugs that appear in a browser on a certain operating system that you don't have. So you weren't aware of it, but if you checked in Browser Stack, you would know about it before it becomes a bug that someone writes into customer support about. So it's a really great tool for being proactive and, working it into your workflow to try to get ahead of those bugs before they cause stress on your poor users who are struggling with it. CodePen is a tool where people post code snippets. And so I think it's also good for inspiration, even if you don't code, just to see what's possible on the web. There's a lot of creative examples on there of what you can do with animated SVGs and CSS Grid and Flexbox, which are all these like CSS things that I get excited about. And you can see examples of what someone's done there. And so this is really helpful, if you get inspired by some technique that you see on CodePen, you can design it in Figma or Sketch or Adobe XD. And then you can send it to your developer and say, hey, like this is what I'm imagining for this mockup that I made. I know that I made this like super static mockup, but just imagine using this code to make it happen. Just like if it's it's just some way of kind of pseudo prototyping it without having to do it. Maybe if it's a more complex animation, Okay, so other than that, yeah, GitHub is what I use to keep track of all of my branches and all of my changes to the code. And Stack Overflow, I'm in there quite often whenever I have any kind of questions, if I get stuck on any kind of coding thing. And Terminal I just use for Get, which is how I push my coding changes to GitHub. So I know that was kind of a lot, and it is in my Figma presentation if you want to refer to it later. So yeah, I hope that gave you some ideas. It's kind of hard to think about pure UX tools specifically because I think I get a lot of value from all of these tools, even though that you wouldn't necessarily peg them UX tools specifically, but they all do relate to the user experience. All right, so just before I end here, I do have a few more tools I wanted to share. So sometimes I want to just build off of existing UI at Team Treehouse. So what I do is I just create a screenshot of the entire page. So if you've ever tried to make a screenshot of just well, I guess just using the keyboard commands, I'm like trying to do it on my keyboard, but you can't see. Then you can just take a screenshot of the visible part of the screen, but maybe the screen has a long scroll. So you can just do an entire screenshot of the entire website if you go into DevTools. So right click on the website, select Inspect, open up the command panel, and then type screenshot. And then from there you can choose capture a full-size screenshot. And so I take this image and then I pull it into Sketch, and then say I just want to replace this this tab bar with something else. I can just draw a gray box over it and then add my new design there. So it's kind of a shortcut because I don't want to design the entire thing in Sketch if I don't already have that designed. It's a shortcut to just get to the point of what I do want to change. I also use Giphy Capture if I want to create a little animated GIF of maybe a bug or some kind of interaction that I want to do. So this is helpful if you don't want to take a QuickTime video. You know, certain platforms don't allow videos very easily. Like I think a GitHub PR, I think you can add a GIF, but not like a video super easily. And another one is this tool called Contrast, which is Mac only. Sorry for you folks that aren't on Mac. I'm sure there's a tool like this for Windows. I'm just not aware of it, but I would try Googling. So this lives in the top in the toolbar of your computer. So at any given time, you can just pull down the color picker and pick a foreground color and a background color, and then it gives you the contrast score. So this score is like super high, 17 is pretty high. So that's a triple A, like A+ accessibility. And I find that this is really helpful for me to just grab colors. I use this multiple times a day. And you know, it's not always even for color contrast. Sometimes it just helps me grab a hex color really easily. So I definitely recommend this. There are free tools that you can use in the browser, but I just found that there's too much friction having to go to a bookmarked website to do the color contrast calculator. I know it's so easy just to have this in my toolbar. And there is a cost to this one. I think it's $7, so FYI. But in my opinion, it's money very well spent. All right, so then last one, I love using the tool Grammarly just to check spelling and so on. It does check spelling and grammar issues and gives you recommendations in Google Docs and Gmail. But I really wish that we had something like this for all of our design tools, because I know that like pretty much every mockup has some spelling mistakes somewhere. It's like so easy because there's not any tool to catch those mistakes within the design tools. But if you know of one, let me know. There might be some kind of sketch plugin I'm not aware of. All right, so that is the end of my little spiel. If you have any more questions, let us know in the chat. That's actually all I have time for today, but I'm really curious to hear what's on your mind, because that'll help me have some topics to talk about next time. So I hope you learned a thing or two, or at the very least enjoyed seeing a few examples and learning about some new tools. And other than that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And I guess Puff is joining us for this final moment to say goodbye. This is my cat, Puff. Whoops, sorry. Puff is always eager for attention, so it really makes sense that she's taken my spotlight. All right. Well, it's good to have you here, and thanks for joining me. See ya.